All right, well, it's always hard to pick just one question, but if I could only pick one question about the next year, it would be this. The pandemic has revealed that many complex systems have prioritized efficiency over redundancy, robustness, resilience. How much do you think the pandemic will alter that balance, and how lasting is that effect likely to be?
Good one. Who would like to take a first stab at that? Jess, why don't you go first?
You knew I would answer that question, didn't you, David?
I think so. I think so.
Okay. So will it change? I don't know. But I think perhaps one step in promoting change is to be clear about what design for robustness would entail. And so to do that, what I want to do for a few minutes is introduce a concept that David and I and some others at SFI have been developing called emergent engineering. And in a truly, this is a very preliminary work, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but in a truly capable system, there's no commitment to any particular outcome. The objective would be to let good solutions, be they policies or social structures or organizational designs, to challenges that the system encounters emerge through a process of collective intelligence. And this is a fundamentally different strategy than, and philosophy for that matter, than what we embrace now, and certainly that we've embraced in our history. A somewhat weaker version of this would be to build an E-capable system, but constrain it so that it respects certain principles or values that we collectively deem important. So here, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself here to another question, but here's where ethics and science touch. As an example, rather than guaranteeing a particular form of government or governance, we might let an appropriate strategy emerge given environmental challenges, but we guarantee something we agree on is important, like, for example, and this maybe we don't all agree this is important, that there's a high minimum quality of life for all individuals through something like social insurance. Suresh was talking about that yesterday. And the weakest form of an E-capable system stresses process over outcome and robustness and adaptability, which is of course involved in all the other forms I just mentioned, and scenario planning over forecasting. And I guess most importantly, it proposes building tuning mechanisms into systems that control how fluid they are and how responsive they are by adding levers that allow for adjustment of timescales, in particular, control of timescale separation, adjustment of distance from tipping points or critical points. Now, if you're familiar with SFI's history, which I think everyone in this room is, you're probably thinking, well, we've moved into familiar territory here. These ideas have long been discussed at SFI, and some progress, of course, on levers has been made and implemented in various domains in the real world, in economic systems like the Fed and so forth. However, the idea that we can optimize for robustness and adaptability by tuning timescale separation between, for example, individual behavior and institutions is a relatively new idea and doesn't have many design precedents. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to give one example, and that comes from nature, from schooling fish. So most of the time, schooling fish, not all fish school, but schooling fish, they're in what's called a shoal. That means they're loosely aligned, foraging together. And then a predator perhaps appears, and one fish detects the predator, and they flip into a schooling state when they're all closely aligned, and they can both confuse and or evade the predator more effectively. So essentially what we've got here is it's a little bit under debate, but it's thought that this is made possible by the fact that the fish in the shoaling state sit near a critical point. So that allows information that observant fish detecting the predator to go move across the system rapidly. And now, of course, they don't know whether the predator is going to appear. They don't know when that's going to happen, but they know what to do when that predator does show up. So there is some uncertainty in this example. And what we get is essentially the fish have in their repertoire, their sort of social system repertoire, two states, schooling and shoaling, and they can move between these as the environment demands. Now, and for some of the situations we've been dealing with, like COVID, where we haven't maybe experienced this kind of shock before, the fish have seen the predator for a long evolutionary history, we want to be able to move into a state that's exploratory, right? And what we can probably guess by moving into this exploratory state, that there's going to be some cost associated with that, but whatever we discover there is probably going to be better to the overfit state we were previously in, right? So that's an important point. So what I'm sort of proposing here is that we, to answer Ian, come back to Ian's question, is that we consider designing systems that can move between different aggregate states as the environment demands, and maybe we allow that exploration to be more sort of operational when we detect that the environment is becoming uncertain. And we control or keep the system from doing that exploration when we have a feeling that the environment is more stable. And that finally, the sort of newer part, that in addition to building mechanisms for shifting between states, we build in 2D mechanisms that allow us to control how sensitive our system is to noise. So that's sort of my long answer to Ian. I think there's a lot we could build on based on work at SFI to design systems for robustness and adaptability. And we definitely should be thinking hard about how to do it.
So I know that Doyne and Ricardo have questions. So Doyne, go ahead.
I just want to say this idea has been around a long time, the idea of resilience versus robustness and the trade-off that complex systems make. Joe Tainter, who's often appeared at SFI, had it in his book on collapse of civilizations, that civilizations collapse because as they become more complex and they become brittle and they fall down. Around the beginning of the millennium, Gene Carlson and John Doyle had the theory of highly optimized tolerance, that complex systems evolve to be robust yet fragile. So they're robust to perturbations, to shocks, and that they feel with some frequency. They become fragile to perturbations that they never see because they're constantly tuning themselves to optimize, and optimization drives that. Now, in the pandemic, I think what we're going to see is, a year from now, 2 years from now, we're going to be much more robust to the next pandemic. But there are other things out there that we're going to be fragile toward. And I think what Jessica's talking about is trying to look ahead and proactively think, what are the perturbations, shocks that might hit us that we're fragile to? And can we actually re-engineer things in society to fix that? So for example, we're working on robustness of supply chains. How can we re-engineer them to make them more robust? We have to begin by at least knowing what they are, which right now we don't even know. But so I think this is one of the principles of complex systems, and so I think it's a very good question that we as complex systems scientists should be able to really do something useful on.
Thanks, Doyne. Ricardo.
Yes, excellent question. Let me start by saying that you make a system robust to something you know that you have to be robust to. And in a complex system, you don't know what you need to be robust to because you cannot imagine all the things that can go wrong. For example, in the global financial crisis, nobody thought about subprime mortgages, and suddenly it was about subprime mortgages. And now nobody thought about COVID, and now it's COVID. I split my time between managing a group of postdocs that do basic academic research and managing a group of people who help governments manage to take economic decisions. And this year we've been working with 12 governments on helping them navigate through COVID. There was in the global financial crisis a difference of 2 orders of magnitude between what the shock cost, say, Belgium or Switzerland, and what the shock cost Latvia or Greece. And right now we're seeing enormous differences in what you might want to call resilience of these different countries. And you might talk about resilience of COVID, but right now there is, not only did you just see Hurricane Eta, now there's Hurricane Iota. And it's going to go through the same path through Honduras and Guatemala that the previous one did, 2 countries that were deeply hit by COVID. So there's just a budget for thinking about resilience in the abstract. I think that what some systems achieve robustness is by solving the last crisis and preventing the reoccurrence of the last crisis because it captures the attention. And if there's enough crises over time, you've fixed many potential future crises. But the system is just too complex not to be able to anticipate, all the things that can go wrong, and to design themselves or to achieve robustness. We still have a long ways to go to understand why there's such a dramatic difference in robustness to what appears like a common shock. COVID is the same more or less everywhere in the world. There's at least, I would put it to you, more than 2 orders of magnitude difference between the consequences in some parts of the world and the consequences in others.
Oh yeah, okay. So just 2 comments on that. So first, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with the idea that robustness is about controlling things we've seen. So I think that doesn't have to be the case, and there are lots of examples from nature where it isn't. So a lot of robustness mechanisms like modularity, even things like relationship repair, are generic mechanisms that can be used in a lot of different situations, or which buffer damage that, say, a perturbation takes out a component, downstream components feel. And so it's not necessarily about controlling tightly or maintaining a particular function tightly. Sometimes it's about this buffering. And the second point, where I totally agree with Ricardo, is that the assumption that continues to plague us is the assumption that we know what the problems are. And COVID illustrates that we don't, and we design and we over-design for problems we've just faced. The towers are the terrorism and so forth is a great example. Now to come at this from a different angle, just to sort of make where I'm going clear, one change I would like to see in the collective intelligence literature, particularly in the social sciences, this isn't so much of a problem in systems biology and so forth, is a move away from focusing on forecasting outcomes like will Iran develop a nuclear arsenal and prediction of ground truths like what the weight of a steer is, and towards thinking about individuals as sensors, components as sensors. They're information processing sensors that can potentially detect unknown challenges in the environment, especially if the sensors are diverse. And then that information can get aggregated so the system can figure out actually what the problems are. So instead of assuming that the problems are known and asking how does the system know what the answer to that problem is, what is the problem in the first place? And context for discussing this is a great one, is the Electoral College. So if we just put aside for a moment constitutional issues, which there are many, the Electoral College in my mind is a misguided, so like, a lot of people want to throw it out, especially among my sort of liberal academic colleagues. I'm going to get rid of the Electoral College and just go with the popular vote. Well, it's a misguided attempt in some sense to ensure geographic fairness. But I see it as really its unrealized value is allowing information from different parts of the United States to inform aggregate decision making. Now, I agree it is not well designed to this end, but that's how we could think about it. The United States has many different needs. They're not just the needs of people on the coast or the needs of geography and so forth, resources on the coast. How could we design an aggregation mechanism better than the Electoral College that thinks about individuals voting as sensors with valuable information?
So Ian, look what you unleashed. That's it's a big issue for us at SFI. It's a central one, I think. I don't know if you have a reply, Ian, or.
No, it's really just, I really appreciate the responses. And I guess for me, it's trying to find, with my economist hat on, that Pareto optimal curve, right? Where we can actually get some more robustness and perhaps not sacrifice some efficiency. And I haven't seen enough on that, but I think there's a lot of fertile ground there. And this emergent engineering sounds right up that alley.